For this lesson, you should still have the Expenses Claim 1 workbook open from the previous lesson, Lesson 8.11. This lesson introduces macro security. Why is macro security needed? Well, macros are a wonderful Excel feature, but they can also be dangerous. It's possible to record a macro that will damage your computer in many ways. Macro security provides several methods to identify which macros you can trust and which you can't. You shouldn't trust any macro-enabled workbook that's sent you across the internet, unless it's digitally signed. It's impossible to be sure of an email sender's identity. It's extremely easy to send an email with a forged name and email address. Excel 2007 has taken a huge leap forward in the battle against macro viruses. There used to be one Excel workbook format, called the XLS file, but now there's two. The first is the normal Excel workbook with the XLSX file extension. This type of workbook can always be trusted because it's incapable of storing a macro. The Excel Macro Enabled workbook with the XLSM file extension is capable of carrying destructive macro viruses, so you must ensure that you can trust the origin of this type of workbook before you open it. When you open an Excel Macro Enabled workbook, you'll normally be confronted with a warning dialog, but Excel provides 3 mechanisms for recognizing a trusted workbook, and when the workbook is trusted, you won't see these warnings. The first way you can trust a workbook is to place the workbook in a trusted folder, and this is probably the best option. Excel allows you to designate a folder as a trusted location. You're then able to open macro-enabled workbooks that are saved to this location without warnings or restrictions. The second method is to digitally sign the macro. You learned all about digital signatures in Lesson 6.14. Excel can be configured to run digitally signed macros from trusted publishers without warnings or restrictions. The final way to trust a macro-enabled workbook is to warn the user before running a macro. In this case, Excel warns you that a workbook contains macros and asks you whether you want to run them. We'll discover how to implement each of these methods in Lesson 8.13. But now you understand macro security, we're ready to save this macro-enabled workbook. The workbook is actually currently an anomaly. It's a regular Excel workbook that contains a macro. Excel cannot allow such a workbook to be saved. So let's attempt to save the workbook and see what happens. I click the Save button and a warning dialog appears. Excel warns me that I cannot save this workbook as a regular, macro-free workbook. If I were to click Yes at this point, the macros in this workbook would not be saved with the workbook. But I do want the macros to be saved with the workbook, so I click No, and the Save As dialog appears. I'm going to save the workbook as an Excel Macro Enabled workbook named Expenses Claim 2. And as usual, I'll save it to the folder above my sample files folder. I won't be able to save this as an Excel workbook. I need to choose Excel Macro Enabled workbook. I choose the Macro Enabled workbook and then click the Save button. And for this lesson, we're done.